Commander Vextal of the Zephyrian Empire's elite psychic reconnaissance division adjusted his neural interface crown and gazed out at the blue marble spinning lazily in space. Earth. Such a pathetic little world, really. No energy shields, no quantum communications, and their most advanced technology was apparently something called TikTok, which their preliminary scans suggested was either a weapon of mass distraction or a very elaborate mating ritual. Initiating deep mind probe protocols, announced Senior Analyst Crixon, his tentacles dancing across holographic controls with the confidence of someone who had mentally violated 17 different species without breaking a sweat. Target acquisition in progress. The plan was flawless, as all Zephyrian plans were. Slip into a few human minds undetected, extract their deepest fears and desires, map their psychological weaknesses, then use that intel to conquer them without firing a single plasma cannon. Clean, efficient, and they'd be home in time for the spawning season festivities. I'm detecting optimal neural activity from Grid Sector 7G, reported Communications Officer Blepthy, whose psychic abilities were so refined she could read thoughts from 3-star systems away. Subject appears to be in a heightened state of mental activity, perfect for extraction. What they didn't know was that their optimal target was Jake Morrison, age 28, retail associate at Megamart, currently lying in bed at 3:17 a.m., phone glowing in his face as he scrolled through an endless feed of memes about how adulting was a scam and wondering if his life choices had disappointed his houseplants. Commencing infiltration, Vextal announced, activating the psychic link. The first thing that hit them wasn't fear or primitive territorial instincts or even basic survival thoughts. It was a mental image of a cat, wearing a hat with the text, "I can has invasion," followed immediately by Jake's stream of consciousness, wondering whether aliens would understand cryptocurrency, and if they'd judge him for having cereal for dinner 3 nights in a row. Correction's tentacles froze mid-gesture. "Commander, I'm detecting some unusual neural patterns." "Define unusual," Vextal replied, though he was already getting a creeping sensation that this wasn't going according to the manual. "The subject appears to be simultaneously anxious about, let me parse this, student loan debt, the heat death of the universe, whether he left his car unlocked, and something called cancel culture. Also, he's wondering if hot dogs are technically sandwiches, and why humans say after dark when it's actually after light." Blepthy's eye stalks crossed as she tried to process the incoming data stream. "Commander, he's also generating what appears to be humor about our invasion. He just thought, and I quote, 'Great aliens, probably hear about my car's extended warranty.'" Vextal felt his confidence cracking like a poorly constructed mind shield. In 17 successful conquests, no species had ever responded to psychic infiltration with jokes about automotive insurance. "Perhaps we've encountered a defective specimen. Broaden the scan." But Jake's mind was already wrapping around their psychic probe like a mental boa constrictor made of pure chaos, dragging them deeper into his 3 a.m. thought spiral about whether cereal qualified as soup and why his brain always chose bedtime to remember every embarrassing thing he'd ever done. The last coherent thought Vextal had before the full horror hit was wondering why this human's anxiety somehow had anxiety of its own. What happened next would go down in Zephyrian military history as either the greatest tactical disaster or the most unintentionally effective psychological warfare demonstration ever recorded. Hugh Crixon, who prided himself on his analytical mind and had successfully mapped the neural networks of entire civilizations, found himself suddenly overwhelmed by Jake's internal monologue about whether he should have texted back that girl from accounting faster, slower, or at all. The alien's sophisticated thought processes ground to a halt as he experienced, for the first time in his 3-century lifespan, the uniquely human emotion of social anxiety, mixed with self-doubt and garnished with a healthy dose of imposter syndrome. "I don't understand," Karix whispered, his voice shaking. "Why does this creature simultaneously believe he's both completely worthless and also somehow responsible for everyone else's happiness? The logical inconsistency is breaking my cognition centers." Meanwhile, Blepthy had made the critical error of diving deeper into Jake's memory banks, hoping to find something that made sense. Instead, she got trapped in what appeared to be an endless loop of cat videos, followed by Jake's genuine confusion about why he found them so compelling, followed by his guilt about watching cat videos instead of being productive, followed by more cat videos as a coping mechanism for the guilt. "Commander," Blepty reported, though her voice had taken on a distinctly glazed quality, "the subject appears to be entertained by small domesticated predators performing mundane activities, and he's aware that it's illogical but continues anyway. I'm detecting something called doom scrolling, where he voluntarily consumes information that makes him upset, then gets upset about being upset, then continues consuming the upsetting information. Bextall tried to maintain command composure, but Jake's consciousness was seeping into his own like a mental oil spill. He was beginning to understand why humans said, "It's fine," when nothing was fine. Why they kept broken things just in case, and most disturbingly, why they would spend 20 minutes looking for the TV remote instead of just walking over and changing the channel manually. "Sir," Crickshawn continued, his tentacles now twitching erratically, "I'm also detecting what he calls memes. They appear to be cultural information units designed to be shared, but they're not practical knowledge. One of them is just a picture of a dog sitting in a burning room saying, 'This is fine.' I don't understand the strategic value, but I can't stop thinking about it." The worst part was that Jake had noticed something was wrong with his thoughts. Not the alien intrusion, mind you, but the fact that he'd been lying in bed for 3 hours and hadn't accomplished anything. His response wasn't fear or confusion about the mysterious mental presence. Instead, he'd somehow concluded that his inability to fall asleep was probably his fault for drinking coffee after 2 p.m., and now he was spiraling into self-recrimination about his poor life choices while simultaneously creating elaborate fantasies about what he'd do if he won the lottery, even though he'd never bought a lottery ticket. "Extraction protocols, now!" Vextall ordered, but it was too late. Jake's mind had latched onto their psychic connection like a lonely person at a party who'd finally found someone to explain their entire life story to. The thing about psychic networks is they're designed for efficiency. When one Zephyrian discovers something important, it gets shared instantly across the entire fleet through their collective consciousness. This feature had won them dozens of wars and made their empire the most formidable psychic force in 3 galaxies. But it was also about to be their downfall. The contamination spread through their neural network like a particularly virulent meme, which, coincidentally, was exactly what it was. Within minutes, bridge officers across 17 ships were experiencing Jake's profound confusion about why humans park in driveways and drive on parkways. Navigation specialists found themselves paralyzed by the sudden understanding that abbreviated is such a long word, and weapons officers were questioning why they called it cargo when it went by ship and shipment when it went by car. Admiral Kethrim, Supreme Commander of the Invasion Fleet and a being whose mind had remained unshaken through the mental screams of dying civilizations, was in his private quarters trying to understand why Jake kept all his old cables just in case, even though he couldn't remember what half of them were for. "This is illogical," Kethrim muttered, tentacles wrapped around his head as if he could physically hold his sanity together. Why does he maintain emotional attachments to non-functional objects? Why does he feel guilty about throwing away a box that contains something he bought 3 years ago? But that wasn't even the worst part. The worst part was Jake's memories of social interactions, which were now flooding through the Admiral's consciousness like a highlight reel of human awkwardness. Every time Jake had said, "You too," when someone said happy birthday. Every time he'd waved back at someone who was waving at the person behind him. Every time he'd held a door open for someone who was too far away, creating that awkward fast walk situation. The Admiral's aide, Lieutenant Zorksip, burst into the quarters in a state of barely controlled panic. "Sir, we're losing cohesion across all divisions. The entire 3rd Battle Group has become obsessed with something called the Office, and they keep quoting it instead of following orders. Engineering is refusing to work because they've discovered the concept of quiet quitting, and our Psychic Warfare Division has started a group chat to discuss their feelings." "Their feelings?" Ketrim demanded, though he was simultaneously experiencing Jake's deep shame about that time in 7th grade when he'd confidently answered purple when the teacher asked what the capital of Montana was. "Yes, sir. Apparently humans have this thing called emotional labor, and now our officers are questioning whether they're being properly compensated for the psychological stress of conquering planets. They've also started using something called reaction gifs in official military communications." Kethrim pulled up the fleet-wide communication channel and was immediately assaulted by a stream of messages that read like "mood, this you, and no cap fra fra," accompanied by moving pictures of humans making exaggerated facial expressions. The breaking point came when he accessed Jake's student loan debt anxiety and experienced for the first time in his immortal existence the uniquely human combination of nihilistic acceptance and grinding, persistent worry about a problem that couldn't be solved through military conquest or psychic domination. "Sir," Zorksip continued, "the Emperor's demanding a status report, but our communications officer can only respond in what she calls Twitter speak, and keeps asking if we're triggering the libs with our invasion." Kethrim closed all 16 of his eyes and tried to remember what it felt like when his biggest concern was the heat death of distant stars, not whether he'd remembered to turn off his imaginary coffee maker before leaving his non-existent apartment. Back on Earth, Jake Morrison was having what he would later describe as the weirdest Tuesday of his life, which was saying something considering he once got trapped in an elevator with a mariachi band and a woman who insisted on explaining cryptocurrency using only fruit metaphors. It started when he woke up in his houseplant. A half-dead succulent he'd optimistically named Fernando spoke to him. "Morning, Jake," Fernando said in what could only be described as a depressed Scottish accent. "Lovely day to contemplate the meaninglessness of existence, isn't it?" Jake, who had reached a point in his life where talking plants barely registered as unusual, just nodded and said, "Yeah, Fernando, want some coffee? It's not like it'll help either of us feel better about anything." "Might as well," Fernando sighed. "Though I should mention, your other plants are having what I believe you humans call an existential crisis. Patricia over there," he gestured with a drooping leaf toward a spider plant, "has been questioning whether photosynthesis is just elaborate procrastination. And don't get me started on what the cactus has been saying about the futility of water conservation." This might have concerned a normal person, but Jake had bigger problems, like the fact that he'd been getting weird mental feedback all morning. Every time he thought about work, he could swear he heard what sounded like alien voices screaming in terror. When he considered his student loans, there was definitely some kind of psychic wailing happening in the background. Most disturbing of all, when he'd absent-mindedly wondered why refrigerators had lights but freezers didn't, something in his brain had made a sound like a civilization collapsing. "Fernando," Jake said slowly, "you don't happen to know if houseplants can develop psychic abilities, do you?" "Oh, that's not us, mate," Fernando replied cheerfully. "That's you. You've gone and broken some aliens, apparently. They're all connected to your head now, poor bastards. Every time you think something particularly human, they have what I believe you'd call a mental breakdown. It's quite entertaining, actually." Jake paused with his coffee mug halfway to his mouth. "I'm sorry, what now?" Fernando's leaves rustled with what Jake was learning to recognize as plant laughter. "Aliens, Jake. Big space empire, tried to read your mind, got more than they bargained for. Now they're all psychically linked to your consciousness, and every time you have a typically irrational human thought, it's like setting off a logic bomb in their collective brain." Jake considered this information while simultaneously wondering if he should feel guilty about not flossing regularly, which apparently caused several alien ships to temporarily lose life support. "So you're telling me," Jake said carefully, "that my anxiety and existential dread are currently destroying an alien invasion fleet. That's the gist of it, yes. Also, your tendency to overthink social interactions has apparently caused their emperor to cancel 3 different conquest plans, because he's too busy replaying every conversation he's ever had and wondering if he came across as rude." Jake felt a strange sense of power rising within him. For the first time in his adult life, his crippling overthinking and social anxiety weren't just personal problems. They were weapons of mass confusion. "Fernando," he said, a slow smile spreading across his face, "I think it's time I lean into this." He closed his eyes and began to think, really think, about the most uniquely human paradoxes he could summon. Why do we say after dark when it's after light? Why is it called a building when it's already built? Why do we press harder on the remote control when we know the batteries are dying? Somewhere in space, Admiral Kethrim began weeping tears he didn't know he could produce. Jake opened his mental floodgates and let loose a torrent of human illogic. He thought about how we say we slept like a baby when babies wake up every 2 hours. He pondered why abbreviated is such a long word and why phonetic isn't spelled the way it sounds. He contemplated the social rules that make it rude to not answer "How are you?" even though nobody actually wants to know how you are. "Oh, this is brilliant," Fernando said, practically vibrating with glee. Half their fleet just went offline trying to process why humans say "I could care less" when they mean "I couldn't care less." But Jake was just getting started. He began deliberately crafting the most psychologically destructive thoughts possible. He imagined explaining to aliens why humans keep broken things just in case, why we feel guilty about throwing away gift boxes, and why we maintain emotional attachments to old t-shirts that are more whole than shirt. Then he hit them with the big one, the realization that every decision creates infinite alternate timelines where you made different choices, and now you have to live forever, wondering if the other versions of you are happier. Patricia the spider plant started making what could only be described as impressed whistling sounds. "Jake, I think you just caused their entire philosophy department to have a collective nervous breakdown." Jake grinned and reached for his phone. If he was going to weaponize his depression and anxiety against an alien invasion, he might as well do it properly. He opened Twitter, Instagram, and TikTok simultaneously and began deliberately consuming the most mentally destabilizing content human civilization had to offer. The psychic screaming from space became audible. What Jake couldn't see from his crappy studio apartment was the absolute pandemonium unfolding across the Zephyrian fleet. If he could have witnessed it, he probably would have felt bad about it, which would have only made things worse for everyone involved. Commander Vextal, the once proud leader of the elite psychic reconnaissance division, was currently huddled in his command chair, frantically trying to create what humans call a Finstapa, fake Instagram account, where he could post his real feelings. He'd already uploaded 17 blurry photos of the ship's corridor with captions like, "Nobody gets me," and "Why is space so empty, like my soul?" "Sir," his aide approached cautiously. "The Emperor demands a status report. Tell him I'm busy discovering myself," Vextal replied without looking up from his phone. "Also, do you think this filter makes my tentacles look fat? I'm having body image issues, and Jake's memories of trying on clothes in dressing room lighting are really messing with my self-perception." Meanwhile, Senior Analyst Quixon had barricaded himself in the data analysis chamber and was experiencing what he kept calling his quarter-life crisis, despite being 347 years old. He'd covered the walls with printouts of motivational quotes he'd found on Pinterest and was working on a vision board that mostly consisted of pictures of Earth cats and the words, "Maybe try yoga? I just feel like I'm not living my authentic life," he explained to anyone who would listen, which was nobody because the rest of his team was too busy having their own breakdowns. Like, what if I'm not meant to be analyzing alien civilizations? What if I'm meant to be, I don't know, making artisanal space cheese? Is that even a thing? Should it be a thing? The situation on the bridge of the flagship was even worse. Communications Officer Blethy had abandoned all pretense of military protocol and was running the ship's communication array like a social media influencer's live stream. She'd gained 40,000 followers across 17 different platforms and was currently doing something called an unboxing video, where she showed off standard military equipment while providing commentary like, "This plasma rifle is cute, but honestly, the ergonomics are not it, bestie." Blethy, Admiral Kethram attempted to interject during what appeared to be her review of the ship's emergency rations. "We need to contact High Command." "Can't right now, Admiral," she replied, not looking away from her ring light setup. "I'm in the middle of a brand partnership with a Earth company called Mega Mart. Apparently that's where Jake works, and they want me to promote their seasonal clearance sale." Did you know humans have entire retail events based on the concept of back to school, even though school is a year-round concept for most adults? The psychological complexity of their consumer culture is fascinating, but the real chaos was happening in the lower decks, where Jake's latest mental assault, a deep dive into the comments section of controversial cooking videos, had caused a complete breakdown of military hierarchy. Soldiers were abandoning their posts to start food blogs. The weapons division had organized into two warring factions, based on whether pineapple belonged on pizza, with a small but vocal third group insisting that the real issue was whether pizza was a sandwich, which had somehow evolved into a philosophical debate about the nature of categories and whether anything really belonged anywhere. Engineering had gone full human and declared that they were quiet quitting their jobs, which meant they would do exactly what their job descriptions required and nothing more. This might have been manageable, except that their job descriptions had been written by military bureaucrats 3 centuries ago and were largely incomprehensible, so the entire engine room was now operating under the principle of malicious compliance. "Chief Engineer Threxall," Admiral Kethram called over the communication system, "why are the engines running at exactly 60% capacity?" "Because, sir," came the reply in a tone dripping with newfound passive aggression. "Regulation 2847B clearly states that engines should be maintained at optimal efficiency for standard operations. And after consulting Jake's memories of every terrible job he's ever had, I've determined that 60% is, technically, optimal for someone who's not being paid overtime." The breaking point came when Jake, in a moment of pure human spite, began deliberately thinking about the most frustrating aspects of customer service jobs. He mentally replayed every time someone had asked him, "Do you work here?" while he was wearing a name tag and company uniform. He remembered every customer who had demanded to speak to his manager about problems that were clearly beyond anyone's control, like the weather or the passage of time. The psychic feedback from this particular mental assault caused Emperor Zixtharn himself, supreme ruler of 17 star systems and conqueror of 43 civilizations, to call the customer service line at Megamart to complain about Jake's attitude. despite never having met Jake and living approximately 47 light-years away from the nearest Megamart location. "Yes, hello," the Emperor said into his communication device, which he was now holding like a phone because Jake's memories had convinced him this was the proper way to communicate with customer service. "I'd like to file a complaint about one of your employees. He's psychically infiltrated my mind, and now I can't stop thinking about whether hot dogs are sandwiches. This is unacceptable customer service, and I demand to speak to your manager." The confused Megamart representative, whose name was probably Kevin, tried to explain that they couldn't help with psychic infiltration issues, but the Emperor had already hung up and left a 1-star review on 17 different platforms. By this point, Jake's mental influence had spread so thoroughly through the Zephyrian network that their entire invasion fleet had essentially turned into a floating social media convention. Ships were live tweeting their emotions, conducting Instagram polls about whether they should continue the invasion, and getting into heated TikTok debates about Earth's strangest customs. The final straw came when Jake, scrolling through his phone during his lunch break at Megamart, stumbled across a debate about whether the dress was blue and black or white and gold. The collective psychic scream from the Zephyrian fleet was so loud it briefly interrupted radio transmissions across 3 solar systems. Admiral Kethrim, now speaking exclusively in internet slang he didn't understand, sent a fleet-wide message that simply read, "We can't even. This is not the vibe. Invasion cancelled. Going home to touch grass." 6 months later, Jake Morrison had somehow become the most important person on Earth, which was both hilarious and terrifying, considering he still couldn't figure out how to properly load a dishwasher and had once gotten lost in his own neighborhood. The Zephyrian Empire had not only called off their invasion but had officially declared Earth a Class X psychic hazard zone and established a quarantine perimeter around the entire solar system. The official documentation, which had been leaked by a whistleblower alien who'd started a podcast called My Life Among the Tentacles, described humans as cognitively weaponized chaos entities whose thought patterns posed an existential threat to rational consciousness. Jake's apartment had been upgraded from studio hellhole to diplomatic embassy, though it still smelled vaguely of old pizza and regret. The government had offered him a mansion, a medal, and a 7-figure salary, but Jake had negotiated instead for student loan forgiveness, unlimited coffee, and the right to work from home permanently. Because if he was going to be humanity's unofficial ambassador to confused alien species, he was going to do it in his pajamas. "Morning, Jake," Fernando the Succulent greeted him as he shuffled toward the coffee maker. The plant had developed what could only be described as a British accent and had started offering unsolicited life advice. "You've got 3 species requesting consultations today. The Krillians want to understand why humans keep houseplants as pets, despite them being technically alive. The Vorthon Collective is having an existential crisis about the concept of guilty pleasures, and something called the hive mind of Xerxes is asking for help with what they call group chat anxiety." Jake poured his coffee and checked his phone, which now had a special alien communication app that looked suspiciously like Discord but with more tentacles. His DMs were flooded with messages from confused extraterrestrial beings who'd heard about the human mind virus and wanted to understand everything from why Earth movies always had happy endings to the psychological implications of keeping decorative soaps that were too pretty to actually use. The Krillians first, Jake decided, settling into his desk chair, which the government had replaced with something called an ergonomic consciousness interface that looked like a regular office chair but supposedly helped with psychic communication. He suspected it was just a regular office chair with more buttons, but it was comfortable, so he didn't ask questions. The video call, or rather psychic visual link, activated, showing 3 beings that looked like someone had crossed a jellyfish with a college philosophy professor. Their spokesperson, who introduced himself as academic researcher Blurblatist, appeared to be having some kind of nervous breakdown. "Human Jake," Blurblatist began, his voice shaking with what Jake was learning to recognize as alien confusion. "We have studied your species' relationship with plant life, and we are deeply disturbed. You keep living organisms in your domiciles, you talk to them, you feel emotional distress when they die, but you also sometimes forget to water them. The logical inconsistency is causing our entire botanical research division to question the nature of responsibility and care." Jake sipped his coffee and glanced at Fernando, who had somehow learned to shrug despite being a plant. "Well, Blurble, it's like this. We keep plants because they make us feel better about ourselves and our living spaces. But we're also incredibly bad at keeping things alive, including ourselves sometimes. So we end up in these weird relationships where we love something, we're slowly killing through neglect, which makes us feel guilty, which makes us try harder, which usually makes things worse." The 3 Krillians exchanged what Jake had learned were expressions of mounting horror. "But why," Blurblettis pressed, "do you continue this cycle? Why not simply not acquire plants?" "Because," Jake explained patiently. Having plants makes us feel like we're responsible adults who have our lives together, even when we demonstrably don't. It's aspirational dysfunction. We're not buying the plant, we're buying the idea of being the kind of person who successfully keeps plants alive. The psychic screaming from the other end of the call was becoming concerning, so Jake quickly moved on to the Vorthen Collective, which turned out to be a hive mind struggling with the concept of enjoying things they knew were bad for them. Human Jake, their collective voice echoed in his head. We have analyzed your entertainment media and discovered that you deliberately consume content that you describe as trash, while simultaneously being aware of its low quality. This paradox has caused 17 of our thinking nodes to experience what you might call cognitive dissonance. Please explain why you watch reality television. Jake rubbed his temples. Okay, so guilty pleasures are things we enjoy specifically because they're bad. Like, we know reality TV is manipulative garbage designed to make us feel superior to people who are probably just actors. But that's exactly why it's relaxing. After a day of trying to be a good person in a complicated world, sometimes you just want to watch someone else make terrible decisions and feel better about your own life choices. The silence from the Vorthen Collective stretched on for so long that Jake started to worry he'd accidentally caused them to achieve enlightenment or have a collective stroke. Finally, a small voice from their network whispered, We have been secretly enjoying what you call soap operas. We thought we were broken. Nah, Jake assured them. You're just developing taste. The key is to embrace the trash. Own it. Make it part of your identity. The Vorthens who watch soap operas and know they're terrible are way more interesting than the Vorthens who pretend they only consume high-quality entertainment. The day continued like this. A parade of alien species seeking help with the psychological paradoxes they'd discovered through their attempts to understand humanity. The Regalian Trade Federation needed help understanding why humans bought things they didn't need with money they didn't have to impress people they didn't like. The crystalline entities of Tau Ceti were having a breakdown about the concept of social media authenticity and why humans curated fake versions of their lives to share with strangers. Each consultation followed the same pattern. Aliens discovering some aspect of human irrationality, having an existential crisis about it, then slowly learning to accept that the irrationality was actually the point. By the end of the day, Jake had talked 3 different species through their first experiences with imposter syndrome, explained to a sentient gas cloud why humans said, "I'm fine," when they clearly weren't, and helped a collective consciousness understand why individual humans could feel lonely in a crowd. As he was wrapping up his last call of the day, helping the mechanoids of Proxima B understand why humans kept broken electronics just in case, his phone rang with an actual old-fashioned phone call. Jake Morrison, professional human being, he answered because that was apparently his official title now. Is this the human who broke the Zephyrian Empire? Asked a voice that sounded like someone gargling gravel while having an anxiety attack. Jake sighed and looked at Fernando, who was somehow managing to look smug despite being a plant. Yeah, that's me. What can I help you with? We are the eternal dominion of Vexmorthia, conquerors of 1,000 worlds, and we demand to understand why your species feels the need to apologize for everything, including things that are not your fault. Jake leaned back in his chair, opened Twitter on his phone, and smiled. Well, buckle up, tentacle friends. This is going to take a while. Outside his window, a news helicopter circled lazily, probably hoping to get footage of humanity's secret weapon doing whatever it was he did to save the world. What they would have seen if they could have looked through the walls was a slightly overweight retail worker in pajamas explaining to a collective of space conquerors why humans said sorry when other people bumped into them, while a houseplant provided sarcastic commentary and the coffee maker gurgled ominously in the background. It wasn't the victory humanity had expected, but it was definitely the victory humanity deserved.